The fluorescent lights of the reception barracks at Fort Jackson hummed with a tired institutional buzz, casting a pale, sterile glow on the rows of green duffel bags and the nervous faces of the new arrivals. It was a light that bleached color and exposed every flaw. For Private Sarah Jenkins, it felt familiar, a low-grade hum of institutional inertia she had come to know in a dozen other sterile rooms on 3 continents. She stood in line, a ghost in the machine, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutral apprehension, just another nervous recruit in a sea of them. At 31, she was a decade older than most of the teenagers fidgeting around her, a fact that did not go unnoticed. Drill Sergeant Cole strode down the line, his smoky bare hat casting a sharp shadow over his face, his boots striking the polished linoleum with the percussive authority of a hammer. He was a caricature of military might, all sharp angles and bellowed commands, his chest puffed out with the temporary godhood bestowed upon him by his station. His eyes, small and dark, scanned the line of shaved heads in terrified expressions until they landed on Jenkins. He stopped directly in front of her, his presence a wall of starch and indignation. "Well, look what we have here," he drawled, his voice a low rumble meant to carry. The other recruits stiffened, grateful the attention was not on them. "A little old to be playing soldier, aren't we, Grandma?" Jenkins kept her eyes fixed on the wall behind him, her posture relaxed but perfect, a study in quiet compliance. "No, Drill Sergeant." "No, Drill Sergeant," he mimicked in a high, mocking tone. "Is that all you've got? I asked you a question. Do you think you can keep up with these kids, or are you going to need a walker to get to the chow hall?" A few nervous snickers rippled through the ranks. Jenkins didn't flinch. Inside, she was cataloging. The drill sergeant's posture, aggressive, leaning forward, a clear sign of insecurity masked by bravado. His word choice, designed to isolate and humiliate, not to instruct. His goal was fear, not cohesion. It was a flawed methodology, and she made a small, precise mental note of it. "I will keep up, Drill Sergeant," she said, her voice even, devoid of emotion. Cole leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "You better, because I'm going to be watching you, every single step. You are going to be my personal project. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Drill Sergeant." He held her gaze for a moment longer, searching for a crack, a flicker of fear or defiance. He found none, just a calm, steady gaze that seemed to absorb the light in the room. It unnerved him, though he would never admit it. He grunted, a sound of dissatisfaction, and moved on, his boots resuming their rhythmic punishment of the floor. The days that followed blurred into a grueling routine of pre-dawn wake-ups, physical training that pushed the recruits to their breaking point, and classroom instruction delivered with the subtlety of a flashbang. Jenkins moved through it all with an unnerving placidity. She did what she was told, exactly as she was told, no more and no less. Her bunk was a masterpiece of geometric precision, the sheets so tight a coin would bounce off them into orbit. Her uniform was always perfectly pressed, her boots gleaming. She was the model trainee, yet her perfection seemed to irritate Drill Sergeant Cole even more than defiance would have. He saw it as a challenge. He made her lead the morning runs, hoping her old legs would give out. She never faltered, her breathing a steady, controlled rhythm, her pace unchanging whether on a flat track or a steep hill. He assigned her the worst details, cleaning latrines with a toothbrush, scrubbing grease traps in the mess hall. She did them without complaint, her movements efficient and methodical. Her quiet competence began to draw 2 kinds of attention. From recruits like Miller, a cocky 18-year-old from a small town who had appointed himself Cole's unofficial lieutenant, it drew scorn. "Look at Grandma Jenkins," he'd sneer in the barracks after lights out. "Thinks she's better than us because she can fold her socks right." But from others, it drew a quiet sort of respect. A nervous, bookish recruit named Chen, who struggled with every physical task, found his canteen inexplicably full on a long march, or his pack subtly readjusted by an unseen hand to better distribute the weight. He saw Jenkins moving through the platoon like a phantom, observing, adjusting, helping without drawing attention to herself. And then there was Master Sergeant Reyes. A senior drill sergeant from Charlie Company, Reyes was the opposite of Cole. Where Cole was loud, Reyes was quiet. Where Cole relied on intimidation, Reyes commanded respect through his deep, unwavering knowledge of his craft. He had seen thousands of recruits pass through these barracks, and he noticed things. He noticed Jenkins's economy of motion on the obstacle course. While other recruits attacked the walls and ropes with frantic, wasted energy, Jenkins flowed over them. She didn't look fast, but her time was the best in the battalion. Cole had dismissed it as a fluke, shouting at her for not showing enough aggression. Reyes saw it for what it was, absolute efficiency. He saw it in the way she held her rifle, a natural extension of her body, not an awkward piece of metal. He saw it in the way her eyes constantly scanned the environment, even when standing in formation, assessing angles, checking fields of fire, a habit so deeply ingrained it was subconscious. He saw a soldier, a real one, hiding inside the skin of a trainee. He didn't know why she was there, but he knew she didn't belong. He decided to watch and to wait. The pressure in the platoon was building. Cole's leadership style was creating a toxic climate of fear and competition. He encouraged rivalries, punished mistakes with public humiliation, and prized speed over safety. During their initial marksmanship training on a preliminary range, Jenkins watched with growing concern. Cole would rush the recruits through the steps, his voice a constant, stressful barrage over the loudspeakers. "Time's up. Let's go. Move, move, move. You're not here to make friends with the target." She saw muzzles sweeping across the backs of other recruits as they fumbled with magazine changes. She saw fingers resting on triggers when they should have been straight and outside the trigger guard. She saw a recruit drop a loaded magazine and instinctively bend to pick it up, his rifle pointed directly at the trainee in the next lane. Jenkins, 2 lanes down, simply reached over, placed a firm hand on the barrel of the recruit's rifle, and pushed it downrange without a word. The recruit looked up, startled, and she gave him a slow, deliberate nod. The moment passed in a second, unnoticed by Cole, who was busy screaming at someone else, but Reyes, observing from the tower with binoculars, saw it all. Later that day, Reyes found Cole near the barracks, smoking a cigarette. "You're pushing them too hard on the range, Cole," Reyes said, his voice low. Cole blew a plume of smoke. "I'm forging warriors, Master Sergeant, not paper pushers. They need the stress. Combat isn't slow and safe." "There's a difference between stress and chaos," Reyes countered. "They're developing bad habits. Someone's going to get hurt." "I've got it under control," Cole snapped, his insecurity flaring. "They're my recruits. I know what I'm doing." He flicked his cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot before stalking away. Reyes watched him go, his jaw tight. He knew that an environment built on ego was brittle, and it was only a matter of time before it shattered. Jenkins documented it all. Every night, long after the cacophony of snores filled the barracks, she would slip into the latrine, the only place with a dim, constant light. Huddled in a stall, she would pull a small, waterproof notebook and a pen from a hidden pocket in her issued physical training shorts. In tiny, precise script, she recorded the day's events, safety violations, leadership deficiencies, morale indicators, the names of recruits who showed promise, and those who were a liability. It was a meticulous accounting of a system beginning to buckle under the weight of one man's arrogance. Her mission here was not to be a recruit, it was to be an auditor, a scalpel sent to diagnose a cancer within the Army's most foundational institution. Her cover was Private Jenkins, a former logistics clerk who wanted a second chance at a more meaningful career. Her reality was Captain Sarah Jenkins, callsign Spectre, a team leader in the U.S. Army's 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. And from her perspective, Drill Sergeant Cole wasn't forging warriors, he was creating casualties. The culmination of the first phase of training was a live fire exercise focused on buddy team movement. The objective was for pairs of recruits to advance on a series of targets, with one recruit providing covering fire while the other moved forward. It was a fundamental skill, the building block of small unit tactics. It was also inherently dangerous, a complex dance of communication, movement, and controlled violence that required precision and trust. The weather was turning against them. A slate-gray sky had been spitting a cold, persistent drizzle all afternoon. The range was a churned-up mess of red Carolina clay and slick grass. Dusk was approaching, the failing light making the pop-up targets difficult to distinguish from the darkening landscape. It was the kind of environment that demanded caution and methodical execution. Drill Sergeant Cole, however, saw it as an opportunity to ramp up the pressure. "The enemy doesn't care if you're wet," he roared, his voice cutting through the wind. "He doesn't care if you're tired. Move. I want to see aggression. I want to see violence of action." Jenkins was paired with Chen. She kept her instructions to him simple and clear. "Watch my signals. Move only when I'm set. Fire in short, controlled bursts. 3 rounds. Breathe." Chen nodded, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. He trusted her. In the chaos of the last few weeks, Jenkins had become his anchor, a silent source of stability. They moved through the first 2 stations flawlessly. Jenkins laid down a base of fire with unnerving accuracy, her 3-round bursts striking the center mass of the target every time. She would give a sharp nod, and Chen would scramble forward low to the ground before setting up and repeating the process. It was slow, deliberate, and safe. Cole noticed their pace. "Jenkins, Chen, what is this? A picnic? You're falling behind. Get a move on." Ahead of them, Miller and his partner were moving recklessly, fueled by Cole's shouting. Miller was all frantic energy, sprinting from cover to cover, firing long, uncontrolled bursts from the hip. It was exactly the kind of Hollywood-style soldiering Cole seemed to encourage. Jenkins watched them, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. Miller's muzzle discipline was atrocious. His partner was moving before Miller was properly set. They were a 2-man accident waiting to happen. The final station was a low concrete bunker. The teams had to assault it, one providing suppressing fire on the target apertures while the other moved to the side to post the door. Miller and his partner were up. "Go, go, go!" Cole screamed, his voice hoarse. Miller laid down what he thought was suppressing fire, a wild spray of rounds that chewed up the ground well short of the target. His partner broke from cover to run for the bunker. At the same time, Miller decided to move up himself. He scrambled to his feet, his weapon still on full auto, his finger on the trigger. His boot slipped on a patch of wet clay. The world seemed to slow down. Jenkins saw it happen as if through a sheet of distorted glass. Miller's feet went out from under him. He fell backward, his body twisting. As he hit the ground, his finger clenched the trigger. The M4, no longer pointed downrange, spat a burst of 5 or 6 rounds in a wild, uncontrolled arc. The sound was wrong. Instead of the dull thud of rounds hitting the earthen berm, there was a sharp metallic ping as a round ricocheted off the steel frame of a target stand. Then, a wet, sickening thwack, followed by a scream. It wasn't a scream of exertion or fear. It was a high, thin wail of pure agony. Chaos erupted. Recruits who had been watching from the staging area dove for cover, not understanding what had happened. Cole's shouting devolved into a stream of incoherent curses. Miller was on the ground, staring at his rifle in horror, and 20 yards in front of Jenkins, Chen was on the ground, clutching his leg, his face a mask of shock and pain. A dark, pulsing stain was spreading rapidly across the thigh of his uniform. For a single, critical heartbeat, everyone was frozen, paralyzed by the sudden, brutal intrusion of reality into their training. The on-site medic, a young private first class, stood rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with panic. Drill Sergeant Cole's face was ashen. His authority, built on a foundation of noise and bluster, evaporated in an instant. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The heartbeat ended. Jenkins moved. There was no thought, only action. Years of training, of real-world operations where a moment's hesitation meant death, took over. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout but a command, a blade of sound that sliced through the panic. "Cease fire! Cease fire! Cease fire!" The tone was absolute. It was the voice of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. Every rifle on the range fell silent. Every head turned towards her. "All weapons on safe, pointed downrange!" She was already moving, sprinting across the slick ground, her boots finding purchase where others slipped. She didn't run like a recruit. She ran like a predator, her body low, her movements fluid and purposeful. She reached Chen in seconds, dropping to her knees beside him in the mud. The wound was bad, very bad. The round had entered the inside of his upper thigh, and the sheer volume of blood pumping out told her everything she needed to know. Femoral artery. He had maybe 2 minutes. The young medic finally snapped out of his stupor and ran over, fumbling with the snaps on his aid bag. "What do I do?" he stammered, his hands shaking. Jenkins didn't look at him. Her eyes were on the wound. "Give me your bag." Her voice was low, calm, a pocket of absolute stillness in the storm. She ripped open Chen's pant leg, exposing the mangled tissue. "Tourniquet, now!" The medic pulled one out, his movements clumsy. Jenkins snatched it from his hand. "High and tight," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. She looped it around the top of Chen's thigh, as high up as it would go, and began cranking the windlass. Chen screamed again, a raw animal sound, as the band bit deep into his flesh, cutting off all blood flow to the leg. Jenkins ignored it, giving the rod another brutal twist before locking it in place. The pulsing flow of blood slowed to a dark, sluggish ooze. "Time," she said, looking at her wrist. She had no watch. She glanced at the sky. Mark the time as 17:42. She took a marker from the medic's bag and wrote T-1742 on Chen's forehead. Cole was finally moving, stumbling towards them. "What's going on? What happened?" Jenkins didn't even look up at him. Her focus was entirely on her patient. She turned her attention to the young medic. "You, get on the radio, call a medevac. Do you know the 9-line procedure?" The medic stared at her blankly. I think so." "No." Jenkins's voice was like stone. "There's no thinking. You will use my words exactly." She looked at Miller, who was still on the ground, sobbing. "You, Miller, get up, secure your weapon and get over here." Her command was so sharp he scrambled to obey. "Give your weapon to him," she said, pointing to another drill sergeant who had run onto the range. "Then you are going to help me." Fear could be a useful tool, but only if it was focused. She would not let him break. She turned back to the medic. "Radio, now. Listen to me." She began to recite the medevac request from memory, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the static-laced air. Line 1, location. She glanced at the terrain features, the distinctive bend in the creek bed, the cluster of pines on the hill. In her mind, a map grid materialized. She called out the 8-digit coordinates without a moment's hesitation. Line 2, radio frequency, call sign. She rattled off the range's standard frequency. Line 3, number of patients by precedence, 1, urgent. Line 4, special equipment required, hoist. Line 5, number of patients by type, 1, litter. Line 6, security at pickup site. She glanced at Master Sergeant Reyes, who had arrived and was already directing the other NCOs to form a perimeter, his face grim but professional. He met her eyes and gave a single, sharp nod. He understood. He was deferring to her. Secure. Line 7, method of marking, VS-17 panel. Line 8, patient nationality and status, U.S. military. Line 9, terrain description, open field, slight incline, watch for 50-foot pines to the east. It was flawless, a textbook transmission delivered with the calm precision of a seasoned combat controller. The medic just stared at her, then repeated her words into the handset, his voice trembling. Jenkins was already back to work on Chen. The tourniquet had stopped the major bleeding, but he was going into shock. His skin was pale and clammy, his breathing shallow. "We need to keep him warm and elevate his legs," she told Miller, her voice softer now, instructive. "Take off your jacket, put it over him, now." She packed the wound with combat gauze from the medic's kit, her fingers working with a deftness and speed that was mesmerizing. She applied a pressure dressing over the top, wrapping it with practiced efficiency. She was talking to Chen the whole time, a low, steady monologue. "Stay with me, Chen. You're doing good. Medevac is on the way. Just keep your eyes open. Talk to me. What's your sister's name?" "Li," Chen stammered, his eyes fluttering. "Okay, think about Lee. We're going to get you out of here. You're going to be fine." Drill Sergeant Cole stood a few feet away, a useless monument to his own shattered authority. He watched this recruit, this woman he had mocked and belittled, take absolute command of his range, of his soldiers, of his catastrophe. She moved with a purpose he had only ever seen in the most hardened combat veterans. The way she assessed the wound, applied the tourniquet, dictated the 9-line. It was not something you learned in basic training. It was something forged in blood and fire. He saw the look on Master Sergeant Reyes's face. It was not surprise. It was confirmation. Reyes looked at Jenkins, then at Cole, and his expression was one of cold, profound disappointment. In that moment, Cole felt his entire world shrink down to the muddy, blood-soaked ground at his feet. He was no longer a drill sergeant, he was just a spectator at his own failure. The distant whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter blades grew steadily louder, a sound of imminent rescue. Jenkins had Miller and another recruit hold up an orange signal panel. She continued to monitor Chen's vitals, her hand on his neck, feeling for his pulse. She had done everything she could. She had compressed a lifetime of trauma care into 3 minutes of brutal, perfect efficiency. She had built a wall of calm competence against the tide of chaos, and she had held the line. Now she just had to wait. The UH-60 Black Hawk descended toward the range, its rotor wash whipping the drizzle into a stinging spray and tearing at the jackets laid over Chen. It didn't land, hovering 20 feet above the ground as a flight medic was lowered on a hoist. He was a sergeant first class, his face etched with the calm weariness of a man who had seen this 100 times before. He unclipped himself and ran to the casualty, his medical pack already open. He knelt beside Jenkins, his professional gaze sweeping over the scene. He saw the tourniquet, high and tight, the time written on the forehead. He saw the pressure dressing, expertly applied, and the patient positioned to treat for shock. He felt Chen's carotid pulse. It was thready, but it was there. "Jesus," the medic breathed, looking at the tourniquet. "Who applied this?" "I did," Jenkins said, her voice quiet. The flight medic looked at her, at the private insignia on her collar, then back at his work. "This is a perfect application. Textbook. You saved his life. You know that, right? Another 30 seconds of bleed out and he'd have been gone." He began working, hooking up an IV, preparing the litter. He was a professional recognizing another professional, and the rank on her uniform made no sense. "Where did you learn to do that, Private?" Before Jenkins could answer, a black government SUV came fishtailing down the dirt track to the range, its emergency lights flashing. It skidded to a halt in the mud, and the doors flew open. Out stepped the post commander, a full colonel, followed by the command sergeant major. The colonel's face was a thundercloud. He had been in a briefing when the call came in. A live fire incident, a catastrophic training failure, an urgent medevac. It was the call every commander dreads. He strode onto the range, his eyes sweeping the scene, taking in the terrified recruits, the pale-faced drill sergeants, and the controlled activity around the wounded soldier. His gaze passed over Drill Sergeant Cole as if he were a piece of furniture. It passed over Master Sergeant Reyes, giving a slight, acknowledging nod. Then his eyes landed on the blood-spattered private, kneeling in the mud beside the flight medic. His stride didn't falter. He walked directly to her. The command sergeant major followed a pace behind, his presence a silent, looming threat. The colonel stopped in front of her. His voice was low but carried with absolute authority. "Spectre, report." The world, which had been a whirlwind of noise and motion, came to a dead stop. The flight medic froze, his IV kit halfway to Chen's arm. The drill sergeants stared, their mouths agape. Miller, who was helping to secure Chen to the litter, looked up, his face a mask of utter disbelief. Even Chen, drifting in and out of consciousness, seemed to register the name, his brow furrowing in confusion. Jenkins rose slowly to her feet. She did not salute. She stood, mud-caked and blood-stained, and met the colonel's eyes. Her carefully constructed facade of Private Jenkins dissolved, replaced by the quiet, unwavering intensity of a Tier 1 operator. "Situation secure, sir," she said, her voice crisp and formal. "One casualty, U.S., gunshot wound to the right femoral. Hemorrhage controlled via tourniquet and pressure dressing. Patient is stabilized and prepped for immediate transport." She paused, her gaze flicking over to Cole, then back to the colonel. "The training environment is compromised. Multiple safety protocols were violated. The command climate in this platoon is a direct contributor to the incident. I recommend a full operational stand down for this company, pending a formal investigation." Her words were not a suggestion. They were a professional assessment delivered with the weight of someone whose opinion was valued at the highest levels. The colonel listened, his expression grim, nodding slowly. "Understood. Your assessment is noted." He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Drill Sergeant Cole, who looked as if he'd been turned to stone. The colonel's voice dropped, becoming a blade of ice. "Drill Sergeant, step forward." Cole flinched, then shuffled forward, his eyes fixed on the ground. He couldn't bring himself to look at Jenkins. "What is your name and rank?" the colonel demanded. "Drill Sergeant Cole," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "You are hereby relieved of your duties as a drill sergeant, effective immediately," the colonel stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You will hand over your campaign hat and your responsibilities to Master Sergeant Reyes. The command sergeant major will escort you to your quarters. You will not speak to any of the trainees. You will not leave the battalion area. An investigating officer will be with you shortly. Is that clear?" "Yes, Colonel," Cole whispered. The word was a surrender. The command sergeant major stepped forward, a silent, implacable giant, and placed a hand on Cole's shoulder, guiding him away from the range and from the ruins of his career. The flight medic and his team had Chen loaded onto the litter and were signaling the hoist operator. As they lifted off the ground, the medic looked down at Jenkins and gave her a sharp, definitive nod, a gesture of profound professional respect that transcended rank and circumstance. The colonel turned back to Jenkins. "Is there anything else, Captain?" He had used her real rank. The recruits who were close enough to hear gasped. "Captain." The woman they had called Grandma, the quiet private who just did her work, was an officer, and not just any officer. The name the colonel had used, Spectre. It sounded like something from a movie, a call sign. Jenkins shook her head. "No, sir, my work here is done." "Get yourself cleaned up," the colonel said. "My driver will take you to the guest quarters on post. I want a full preliminary AAR on my desk by Oro 800. "Yes, sir." As the colonel and his entourage departed and the Black Hawk disappeared into the darkening sky, Jenkins was left standing on the range with the stunned remnants of the platoon. Master Sergeant Reyes walked over to her. He took off his own Smoky Bear hat, holding it in his hands. "Captain," he said, his voice heavy with a respect he had withheld from Cole, "I had a feeling you weren't here to learn how to march." Jenkins allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Just observing the standards, Master Sergeant." "Well," Reyes said, looking around at the pale, shaken faces of the recruits, "I think you just set one." He put his hat back on, its brim now level and straight. "All right, platoon," he barked, his voice ringing with the authentic authority Cole's had always lacked. "Let's get these weapons cleared and get back to the barracks. Move." The recruits scrambled to obey, but their eyes kept flicking back to Jenkins. They looked at her differently now. The mockery was gone, replaced by a deep and unsettling awe. She was no longer Grandma Jenkins. She was an enigma, a warrior who had walked among them in disguise. Miller avoided her gaze entirely, his face burning with a shame that was far more profound than any punishment Cole could have devised. He had not just been foolish, he had been blind. 2 days later, the post was still buzzing with rumors. The official story was that a visiting training observer had identified critical safety issues, but the recruits of 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company, knew the truth. They spoke of it in hushed tones in the barracks, the story of the quiet private who had become a commander in the blink of an eye. Sarah Jenkins sat in a sterile, windowless briefing room, wearing a clean set of OCPs with the captain's bars on her chest and a combat patch on her right sleeve that few recognized but all respected. The 1st SFOD unit insignia was not authorized for uniform wear, but the subdued Special Operations Command patch spoke volumes. Across the polished table, the post commander and his command sergeant major read her after-action report. It was a brutally honest document. She had used the notes from her waterproof book to lay out a timeline of events, a systemic breakdown of leadership and safety. It wasn't emotional. It didn't mention Cole's personal insults or the platoon's mockery. It was a cold, factual diagnosis of a disease. It listed every safety violation she had witnessed, every instance of poor judgment, every moment where the drill sergeant's ego had superseded the welfare of his trainees. It concluded with a list of actionable recommendations for improving the drill sergeant selection and training pipeline. The colonel finished the last page and set it down carefully. He looked at her, his face serious. "This is comprehensive, Captain, and damning." "It's the ground truth, sir," Jenkins replied. "The system relies on the quality of its NCOs. When that fails, everything else fails. Private Chen was lucky." "Luck had nothing to do with it," the command sergeant major interjected, his voice a low growl. He's alive because you were there. I was there to observe and report, Sergeant Major. I was forced to intervene. The colonel nodded. Your report will be forwarded to TRADOC Command. There are going to be changes. You have my word on that. He paused, studying her. Your assignment is complete. We can have you on a flight back to Bragg this afternoon. Thank you, sir. That evening, Sarah was not on a flight. She was in a small, anonymous room in the distinguished visitors' quarters, a place worlds away from the noisy, communal barracks she had inhabited for the past few weeks. The setting sun cast long, orange fingers of light across the floor. On a towel lay the disassembled pieces of her personal weapon, a highly customized HK-416 rifle she had signed out from the post arms room. It was not the standard-issue M4 the recruits used. It was a surgeon's scalpel, a tool of violent precision, and it was as much a part of her as her own hands. She began to clean it. Her movements were practiced and rhythmic, a familiar ritual that quieted the noise in her head. The scent of CLP solvent filled the air. Each piece was wiped down, inspected, lubricated, and set back into place. The bull carrier group, the firing pin, the charging handle. It was a form of meditation, a way of resetting herself after a mission. She had worn a mask for weeks, subsuming her identity into that of a novice. Now, piece by piece, as she reassembled her rifle, she was reassembling herself. Spectre. She thought of Chen, who was in stable condition at the hospital and would make a full recovery. She thought of Miller, whose cockiness had been shattered and would hopefully be replaced by a hard-won humility. She thought of Cole, a man broken by his own arrogance, a cautionary tale she would carry with her. Her work here was not about punishment. It was about integrity. It was about protecting the institution she served, even from itself. It was about ensuring that the young men and women who volunteered to stand on the wall were forged by the best, not broken by the worst. She was a ghost, a specter, sent to haunt the dark corners of the system and drag its failures into the light. With a final satisfying click, the rifle was whole again. She worked the action, the sound smooth and solid. She engaged the safety and placed the weapon carefully in its case. Her report was filed. The standard was upheld. A life was saved. She stood and looked out the window as the last vestiges of daylight surrendered to the night. It was a quiet ending to a loud few days. She packed her gear. Tomorrow there would be a new mission, a new target, a new place that needed a ghost. And she would be ready.